Hello and welcome to episode 61 of the Metacast Behind the Scenes podcast. I'm Ilya Bezdilev.
And I'm Arnab Dekka.
We are co-founders of Metacast, a podcast app best known for transcripts. So we are all about transcripts. We have transcripts for every episode ever published. If you don't, you can easily generate one. So the app generates transcripts for you on demand, so you can get access to any transcript that you can bookmark, you can search, you can share quotes from it, you can save quotes from there. And as we develop the app further, transcripts will be more and more advanced. So that's the thing that we want to be known for. And we will talk about that specific thing in the episode later today. We are in production on Android, so you can download Metacast on Google Play Store. And we are also in beta on Apple through TestFlight, which you can get through the metacast.app website. And we will be very soon launching on App Store, and we are also going to be talking about that in today's episode. So this podcast is where we talk about how we build the app, how we build the business, building public stuff. So Arnab, what are we going to be talking about today?
So I think first we have 3 or 4 topics. We'll see how long we can do it. We'll try to keep it to about 35 minutes today. I think loneliness of being in a very small company. That's one of the topics.
Woohoo!
Yeah. Then we had a pretty cool request from a couple of users, and we decided we don't have time to build the feature, but we hacked our way around it. So we'll talk about that. Then last few weeks, added to the loneliness is I've been banging my head against some iOS and Flutter woes. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll probably try not to go too deep technical in there. And finally, the thing that Ilya mentioned is what do we want Metacast to be primarily known for? So we're going to talk about that. And then, of course, like we do, we'll close with what we're listening to and reading and all that. Let's go.
Let's start with the confession of a lonely founder.
Yeah, so last couple of weeks, Ilya and Jenny have been away. We have had times like this. So with Jenny, how long has it been? October 1st, 2023, right?
Yes, yeah. So about a year.
Okay, so it's been just about a year, less than a year. Before that, you and I were talking on like WhatsApp and Signal and all that, I think, mostly. But after Jenny started, we primarily transitioned into Slack. So our Slack has been, even though it's just 3 people, it's been pretty vibrant. Because we not just share what's going on in our work, but we also talk a lot about our life and what we're reading and listening, interesting things that are happening in our life, as well as not interesting things, I guess. But last 2 weeks, you both were away, and you were away in a way that you both didn't want to use Slack.
We were unplugged.
Unplugged, yes, both of you. And we have had times where 2 of us or 3 of us were away for like a week, but I think we were still maybe checking Slack or responding to it sometimes, things like that. This time was like truly unplugged for both of you. And I think in the mornings, my ritual is like I wake up around 7 a.m. and I open Slack and see what's new, because you both are time zone wise like ahead of me. So there's already like things happening, or you may have responded to some things that I asked yesterday. So I go through it, and unconsciously, I guess I was getting a bit of a dopamine hit kind of effect from it, like people do from Instagram and Reddit and all that, right? Like you open it up first thing in the morning and doom scroll through it. And these last 2 weeks, I felt like, oh man, this is so sad. Like there's nothing happening, right? And I don't know if you noticed or Jenny noticed, but I kept posting things on Slack.
And we kept ignoring them.
Yeah, which is fine, right? I didn't expect you to read it, but it's like, okay, when they come back, we'll talk about these things. I don't want to forget about it. So it kind of reminded me of that. And I'm glad that we're a small company, but still there's so much collaboration. Whereas I now feel like, I don't know how indie solo developers, solo entrepreneurs go through it, because they literally have nobody to talk to.
Right. And you go to your family and they're like, when are you going to make money again? So it's like pressure from all sides, right?
All sides, yeah. And nowhere to release that pressure into.
Right. And it's like you almost don't want to talk about this stuff with your family sometimes. It's tough. Maybe that's why people go to co-working spaces and to meetups and all that, just to talk to other people, right? As you were talking about this, it made me think that, let's say 6 months ago, we were also at a different stage where, we were knocking out some features here and there. We were working mostly on smaller things where we were releasing every 2 weeks. We had a lot of progress and there was also a lot of collaboration going on. I think for the last couple of months, we entered in this kind of slog stage where we needed to launch on the Google Play Store and now we are working on the iOS launch. It's just a bunch of lonely, uninteresting work that has to be done. That's not around like, oh, how about this feature? Or like, how do we make this UX different, right? Or like, look how I redesigned this. It's more like I'm banging my head on the wall. Why is this not working, right? And it's like so complex that nobody else even wants to look into this. You're like, okay, I will figure it out. But it also creates this environment where you're feeling lonely because you're just working on this and we can't help you really. So there is not much communication happening naturally, right? And when you're banging your head on a wall, I don't think there is a natural desire to like think about big picture and you're just so focused and also frustrated, which I guess compounds the problem, right?
That's our CDO. He kind of, I think once in a while reminds us that he's part of the company because he does nothing else. Although, to be fair, I think that period of going through it was painful because we could not get it working. I literally have like over 100 commits trying to get this one thing to work, could not work. From the tooling that we have, Xcode and all that, there is no obvious hints or clues or errors at why it's not working, right? So that's why it was very difficult. But once it worked, and that was on a beautiful Friday afternoon, I think it finally worked, then it felt like all of this was worth it because we got unblocked for our iOS. We had like 3 features left to deliver for iOS before we launched on iOS. And all 3 were actually coded, but we could not deliver it in a way to Apple devices where they would work. So that was unblocked all in one go. And that was like amazing.
Actually, I think it's a good segue into our next topic about iOS and Flutter problems that we had. So those 3 features were links. I think it's called app links or something. The idea is, so when you have a metacast.app link that links to a podcast or an episode, if you have Metacast installed in your phone, instead of opening a browser for you, it opens the app with this episode. I think people should be familiar with these mechanics from apps like Airbnb and Twitter. Any app, right? You click on the link, it opens the app for you.
But another like super cool thing we do is if somebody sends you a link to a Metacast, any podcast episode with a deep link inside the episode to a specific part, and you tap that link, it'll open it up right there. And you can read it or listen to specifically that segment.
It's basically like YouTube, right? If a link has a time signature or timestamp, it goes straight there, which is really cool because if you have a very long Lex episode and you want to share a specific moment with somebody, in other apps, you have to tell people, okay, go to 1 hour, 53 minutes and listen from there. Whereas on Metacast, you can just send a link from that moment on and then people will open it and listen right from there. So that thing was not working. It worked, but then at some point it broke and you can talk about why it happened. Basically what was happening is you would click on that link and it would open the browser for you. We had no way to trigger an app to open when you click a link. Whereas it worked on Android. And we, from our perspective, didn't change anything. We even had a consultation with Apple on this. I guess we can talk about that too. The other feature that was not working was Apple sign-in. It gave us the clue as to why the other thing, the links were not working too. And the third feature was the Bluetooth device integration. Like if you wear AirPods or if you're in your car, if you do like the play pause button in your car or on your headphones, it would play and pause. But skips were not working. Like if you wanted to skip forward for 30 seconds or skip back for 15, actually I forgot what our defaults are.
10 and 30. So we skip backwards for 10 and skip forward for 30.
Right. And we also make it configurable at some point. It just wasn't working. So like if you're in the car, if you click next or previous, it just would do nothing. It just wouldn't react, which was very annoying for people who are driving and they want to skip an ad or something because it's like 5 minutes of ads and you have to open your car dashboard and like tap on the screen. It was a very inconvenient experience. So that was not working. It's been going on for a long time. I want to say months that we were struggling with this.
That's when I think at some point we decided this is like taking too long. Let's just launch on Android. And I think we talked about this in the last episode.
I think one episode ago, episode 59, I think that's when we talked about that. Yeah. Features we decided to punt on, right? But now that we have to launch an app store, we had no options. We had to figure it out. It was existential, right? So yeah, Arnab, tell us the glory story of this.
Yeah. So these features, Apple sign-in and like universal links, they are native iOS features. And they require you to like set up what Apple calls it are capabilities for your app. They're like extra capabilities. Like my app is able to send push notifications, or it supports these universal links, or it supports Apple sign-in. And you have to configure it on Apple's side, like a website, and also on your app. And there's a bit of madness in the way that Apple has created. To be fair, so Apple created this whole ecosystem, app ecosystem first. They created a lot of things that are only Apple specific. You require Xcode to build all this. Xcode is a tool that Apple provides for like building iOS apps. So you have to use Xcode. And Xcode uses like all sorts of certificates and profiles and basically like security or cryptography management features. All of this have to work in conjunction to make such features that are native to iOS work on your app. So what was happening is before we moved to our like automated build mechanism, CI/CD, we use Tramline and GitHub Actions to build the app every time we push a commit. Before that, we were building it manually. So Xcode, when you're building it manually on your MacBook, there's a flag that automatically manages profiles and certificates. And so we're doing that. And it was beautiful. Like everything works. You don't have to think about anything. When you want to automate the build and you still need to use Xcode, then you have to basically manually configure all these certificates and provisioning profiles. Basically, like if you're on a Mac keychain, you have to automate a lot of keychain actions and all that on our build servers.
In the human language, it's a huge pain in the ass.
Yes. And to be fair to Apple, they came up with it first. So that's why I think Google Android did a much more simplified, more standard way of building apps than they did. So what happened is when we moved our build into our build servers on GitHub, Xcode silently was basically saying, oh, I can't find this profile. Or actually not saying it, that's why it was silent, right? It was nowhere. It was probably unable to find the profile or the certificates in the right place. And it said, oh, these features, I'll just drop them. So that's what it did. And there was no indication in the build logs itself that it was doing that, directly. So the end effect is that there is no errors. The build works. It ships the app to test flight or app store. And it just doesn't enable these features on the device, which is why it was very hard to debug. If you see errors or if you get a clue as to what is going wrong, you can figure it out. But if you don't see any effect, it's harder to figure out what's going on.
It's kind of like debugging JavaScript 20 years ago.
Yeah. So I went through like 100 steps of trial and error of configuring things in slightly different ways with Xcode and all that. All of this is scripted and automated, thankfully. It was not manual. But like we would do one little change and then we have to push a new release to actually test it out. And then after a while, once the app is deployed, you find out that it's still not working. So there was about 100 or so attempts of that. Eventually, I just deleted all our automation and started from scratch reading the documentation again. And even then it didn't work. But I think by going deeper and deeper into all this Xcode details and documentation, eventually I think I figured out what was wrong. And that was that Friday afternoon when the first time universal links and Apple sign-in and everything worked on our debug build.
Right, and I think it was a couple of days before that, I sensed so much frustration from you. I mean, you were not shy saying that you were frustrated.
It had been like 10 days. Every day I just keep trial and error. Because we had no other option. We had to make it work.
Exactly, yeah. And I remember I'm like, let's talk. And you evaded our meeting, but then finally you picked up the phone and I think you were working with our CDO. And I think we talked for a good hour or so. From my perspective, I felt like it helped relieve some of that frustration, even though we didn't really solve anything, but it's more like talking about the founder loneliness. Because like I felt like I had to talk to you.
You ask deeper and deeper questions about what is wrong and like what's happening and all that. And it has also a rubber duck effect. it makes me think twice about what is actually happening and think about all of this again. So yeah, that definitely helped. I think finally getting it work made it feel like, okay, this was worth it. I mean, to be fair, we had no other option other than to make it work. But when it finally worked, it felt amazing. And now I feel great that all these features are working.
Yeah, and actually it was so interesting to find out about you making it work, because it was just before I became unavailable for my travels, right? So I woke up in a sleeper train in the morning and I'm looking at my Apple Watch and there is a notification from GitHub. What did it say? Yeah. Holy shit, I made it work or something like that. Yeah. I mean, it definitely started with holy shit.
Holy shit, it finally worked.
Finally worked, yeah. And it was like, what a way to start a day.
Yeah, you should post that screenshot in the release notes somewhere of this episode, yeah.
Maybe you should make it the cover image for this podcast episode. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to ask you, how about the other one, the audio issue?
The background audio? Yeah, so we have had background audio working for a while with Android, but like you said, Bluetooth and car controls for skip and rewind were not working.
On iOS only?
On iOS only, yes. It was working on Android. And that was also pretty weird because this one comes down to be doing enough trial and error. So the thing is, when you're building in development mode on a MacBook, you're using an iOS simulator. It's not a real iOS device. It's supposed to simulate an iPhone pretty accurately. And for the most part, it does. Pretty much 99% it does. But for these kind of things where it requires system native feature integration, it behaves differently. So we could not debug or we could not figure out what is wrong with this thing on a simulator. Basically, your code sitting on your MacBook running on an actual Apple device is more complicated than you could probably imagine. So that's why we had to again go deeper, read a lot of code, underlying libraries and all that. And I think eventually yesterday we got this feature also working. It was a similar, I think, kind of frustrating path. But once it works, it feels great because we've been struggling with this on and off for months, like you said, right? And eventually we decided we punt on it because we need to focus our energies. We made the Android launch and then we came back to this. So
right. Well, huge congrats.
Yeah. Yeah, so our iOS launch is coming very, very soon now that we're all done with everything. Hopefully Apple approves it quickly too.
Yeah, we're recording this on September 4th, so this episode will come out in a couple of weeks. By that time, we will hopefully have submitted to Apple at least.
Yeah, you're doing the Product Hunt launch first, and then we'll do iOS and then do it again.
Yeah, we are doing the Product Hunt launch actually tomorrow, which means for you listeners, 13 days ago. Yeah, in the next episode, we can talk about how the Product Hunt thing went. Because at first I was actually very excited about Product Hunt and let's do it. I was reading all of these posts, people talking about how they got the product of the day. And then at the same time, you open Reddit and they say Product Hunt is I think they use the word scam. It's it's designed to just drive more people to the platform. It's not helpful. You're not getting real users from that unless you're building for startup founders.
Yeah, I think for SaaS focused at indie or other founders, it works.
Yeah, my point is that it's mixed. So we will go through that ourselves and see how it goes. I'm really curious. All right, so the next topic we have is a request that we heard from a couple of users who were migrating from other apps. In the podcasting world, there is a thing called OPML. I think it has nothing to do with podcasting, actually, the actual abbreviation. Anyway, so OPML is an XML file format. So you can export all of your podcasts in an OPML file, and then other apps can import it.
It's outline processor markup language. It's very generic, basically. Anybody could use it, yeah. But essentially, when you listen to podcasts, if you have been listening to podcasts for a while, you probably have 30, 40, 100 plus maybe podcasts that you have subscribed to over the years. And when you switch from one app to another, you don't want to go through manually and hunt those 100 and subscribe again.
And we did not build this feature right away.
So what is the feature? You can export from some apps. Not all apps, I think, support exporting it, right?
Not all apps, yeah, but some of the independent apps do. And also with Google Podcasts shutting down, they had the feature to export to OPML. So people asked us to import their OPML files. We decided to do what's called the Wizard of Oz approach, where instead of building the feature to import the file, we created a runbook for doing it manually, which consists of parsing the file, getting the feeds from it, then doing some magic to find them in our catalog, if they are not in our catalog, to import them, and then using a backdoor sort of script kind of thing to update the production database with those records to subscribe the user to those podcasts that they want to be subscribed to.
Yeah. Pretty much what you would want the app to do. But like you said, it's a lot of complex steps and there's a lot of edge cases in the process. So we decided it's not worth building this whole thing right now. Let's semi-automate it, right? That's what we did.
To be fair, we were not really thinking about the edge cases. We were like, we just don't have time for that. And then when we did the first import, I was primarily doing it myself and I spent probably like a good day, maybe 2 days going through that, figuring out the process, figuring out all of those edge cases. And I had this holy shit moment where like if we started building this, it would have taken us probably 3 or 4 times longer than our best estimates, just because of all of those edge cases. We're not going to be talking about the edge cases here, but we're like, okay, it will probably be a while before we actually have this feature. But we did this for one user, and another user sent us an email with their file. So the first user had, I think, 120 or so podcasts, of which we were able to import about 117, I think. The second user had over 300. And we were like, wow, okay, so that was way beyond what we imagined a person would have in their library. The interesting thing, though, is after we did that, all was great. And then we get a Reddit thread from the first user. He's like, I can't follow any more podcasts. He was just getting an error, and the error wasn't super helpful. It was something like, cannot follow a podcast. So we started looking and figured out that we actually had a limit of maximum 100 podcasts that you could follow. We did not hit this limit when we were importing the podcasts for the user because we did it through the backdoor. It did not have to go through those checks that the app goes through. So that's why they couldn't follow anything, because it just wasn't working. It was hitting the limit. And we had to urgently change that limit and push a new version to the Google Play Store to fix that. We still do have a limit just because we have to protect ourselves too, because there is cost associated with the podcast that people follow. And also there could be some technical issues, I guess.
No, I think we went deeper and we figured out there are no scaling or technical concerns here. It's just a cost related.
Yeah. And the reason why we initially set the 100 limit, we were like, who's going to follow more than 100 podcasts?
You and I, we listen to a lot of podcasts. I just looked at it right now. You're at 78. I'm at 58. But we do have a lot of users in the 40s and some users in the 60s and 70s. So
I think initially we set this because of the feature that we decided not to build, actually. It was something to do with home. We couldn't figure out how to make it computationally inexpensive to show a big number of podcasts. So we set it to 100 and we were like, if somebody has more, they will complain and then we will figure out what to do. Yeah, and then so somebody complained and we had to undo that decision, increase the limit, yeah. But yeah, it was an interesting exercise. The reason actually this approach is called Wizard of Oz. It kind of looks like the app is doing something on the background, but it's actually a human behind the curtain that does the actual work. Well, we didn't automate it to this extent. People were sending it to us by email, but we were thinking about creating a form where people can submit the file and then it would actually look like something is happening automatically, but it was, a person behind it. So the last topic of today is positioning, right? I think I mentioned in the last episode that I felt like I've not been reading enough nonfiction professional literature in the last couple of years. So I picked up a few marketing books. One of them was 22 Laws of Branding by Al Ries, I think the author is, and there is the second author, I don't remember. It's the same people who wrote 22 Laws of Marketing. I read maybe 4 or 5 chapters, and the thing that really stuck with me there was, what is the word that you want your customers to be associated in their mind with your product? And they were making an example of, what do you think about when you hear Mercedes? You think about prestige. What do you think about when you hear BMW? It's like driving, right? Oh, maybe like a different version of that, but it's like luxury. But also the book was written like 20 years ago. So maybe there were fewer luxury cars back then. So Mercedes was probably like the top of the pack, right? And they have multiple other examples, which I was reading. I'm like, yes, makes sense. Like photocopying is Xerox. PCs were IBMs back in the day, right? Volvo is safety. And it really got me thinking, what should be that word that we should own or should try to own, right? who is the app for? What is it known for? What is the first association that comes with it? I think only today I was walking with my kids on the street and it just came accidentally out of nowhere, transcript. Because that's what we started with. But we were sort of shying away from, like transcript is just a feature. We will also have powerful playlists, and there is a lot more kind of in the roadmap that transcript is just implementation detail for. There also like other apps have transcripts too now, like Apple has them, Spotify has them. I think it will become a table stakes feature at some point, maybe within a couple of years in all podcast apps. But what we've been always thinking about and will continue to be really doubling down on is how do we make knowledge extraction from podcasts really, really powerful? And transcript is the core fundamental user experience and the underlying infrastructure for that.
Knowledge extraction and retention and recall, I guess. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So it's like learning, knowledge, learning, information. So these are the words that we want to be associated with, but they are too vague, right? But the transcript is something that the user can see, the user can touch, quite literally, right? Because we have these things like bookmarking and sharing quotes, and we'll be making more and more powerful enhancements to those. So basically, we want to be the app that is the best in transcripts. Just like if you think about the indie apps, you could think about Overcast as being the best in the audio enhancement. Because they like skip pauses, they have this smart speed control that, it's really good, undeniably good features, right? Which other apps don't have. And we could be kind of similar in a way, right? For transcript. So transcript should probably be the word that we are associated with. And we should be using that more and more. And as we are continuing to evolve features that are centered around the transcript, I think it will be more and more apparent as to how we are differentiated from other apps in this regard.
Yeah, the path ahead, I think, is very long. But the power that the transcript provides is amazing. And I think we'll get there. Now that we've implemented, or we are about to release on iOS, we have launched on Android. And I think we're very close to actually being feature complete as far as a podcast app goes. Then I think that's when we start doing the things that nobody else is doing. Well, we already have some features that nobody else is doing, but that's when we actually focus maybe 80% of our time on these kind of things that nobody else has.
Actually, I'll tell you this. Now on iOS, because we are part of the internal users group and I get the paywall in the iOS app that prevents me from seeing the transcript. And the problem with the sandbox testing of paywall is that you have to click the button, you enter your Apple ID password, which is a pain in the ass by itself. I think it only works for 15 minutes and then 15 minutes later it resets back to the paywall. And I started listening to fewer podcasts because of that. It makes me anxious that if I want to highlight something, the transcript is not there and I may not be in the position to enter the password. And also one of my favorite podcasters, his primary channel is YouTube, but they were also cross-posting to podcasts. I think I mentioned that show Declaration that I was listening to for the last half a year or so. The last 2 or 3 episodes, he only posted on YouTube. And I even wrote to him why do you not post on podcast? But he has a large following, he never responded to me. I almost didn't want to listen to those on YouTube, even though I have YouTube Premium, I can listen to this in the background. But not being able to highlight, because he has a lot of interesting stuff there that I always highlight. It makes me anxious because how am I going to make notes of what I heard? So I think that whole transcript thing is really, really powerful. We just need to find the way to talk about it, to market it to the right people. Because that's another thing. I think we figured out our word. Now, the next thing is who is our tribe? Who is the tribe that we market to? I think it's these kind of knowledge junkies like us, but where do you find them?
Yeah, I think reaching to those right people, marketing to them, that's the next, I think, growth area for us. I'm enjoying the journey because even if we were in a team building an app like this inside a big corporation, we wouldn't be getting all these other experiences of how to figure out which channel to market to and how do you market it and all that. So I'm really enjoying all of these other things that I'm learning too.
We would already had 5 million users if you were out of Amazon on launch day.
Yeah. Or at least people will check it out immediately.
Yeah. But then you probably get flooded with basic requests and you veer away from your vision. You know what's interesting? One of our friends sent me a text probably a year ago with the announcement that Amazon Music had transcripts in, I want to say 2017, 2018, 2019. So a while back. So they did a pilot with a few podcasts and I found those. And only those specific episodes of those specific podcasts had the transcript. So apparently they abandoned it for whatever reason, right? But we can really keep to the vision and really keep going down that route.
Right. Okay, so let's close this out. What are you listening to or reading?
So I already mentioned the 22 Laws of Branding. It's interesting. It's one of those books where I read 5 chapters, and chapters are very short. They're like 5-6 pages. And I feel like I've gotten out of this book what I needed. So I kind of stopped. The other book that I'm actively reading is actually a Russian book called Ночной дозор, which is translated as Night Watch. I think it was translated into English. It's a sort of fantasy, sort of sci-fi-ish kind of story about vampires and magic. And the interesting thing I noticed about this one is, I think it was released in the late 90s, and there was a movie. And the movie really made the whole series of books. It's a 3-book series. It just exploded after the movie in early 2000s. So I read it when I was 20 or so. And I barely remember it. So now I just picked it up again and I started reading it. What's interesting, when you read the book half a life ago, because I'm 40 now, I'm seeing just how much more I'm able to relate to the book. The whole thing happens in the mid-90s Moscow. I wasn't from Moscow, but I was part of that. I was a teenager at that time. There could be a phrase from 5 words. I can build a whole experience by just reading, somebody entering the hallway of a house and he sees X. And by just that X, which is 1 or 2 words, I'm able to reconstruct the whole picture, which I'm not able to do with some of the American books because I didn't grow up in that environment, which is pretty cool. Yeah, I'm halfway through the first book and I'm really, really enjoying it. And I'm trying to get my son hooked on that, but it has some romantic stuff in there as well. And as far as teenagers go, he will probably be like, "Bleh," and stop reading the moment he sees any kind of romantic notion in there.
Are these the movies available outside of Russia also? Or?
They might be. They're over 20 years old. The movies are not as impressive as the book. It's one of those movies where you watch the movie is good, but then you read the book and you're like, okay, that movie is just nowhere near the book. The book has just so much more depth. It must have been translated. I think it's one of the sort of seminal Russian contemporary books. And I've not been listening to podcasts much recently. We got to launch on App Store and remove that freaking paywall for me to get back into the app.
Okay. For me, so I have some family visiting and some friends. Actually, the same friends that were here when you were here last year, just around this time. So they're back here. Even when we are in the car, I'm not listening to podcasts because I don't want to bore them with my podcast. Other than that, there's, of course, US Open going on this year. Formula One is really exciting because there's at least 3-4 different people who can win the whole thing. Whereas the last few years, it's been just one person who has won everything. But outside of that, the Dave Grohl book, by the way, quick callback. So there is music in that book, in the Dave Grohl book. But it's their own music. For the others songs like AC/DC or Metallica he talks about, he just says okay, we can't afford to pay royalties for every listen of this audiobook back to them, so that's why they didn't include it. So I'm listening to that. I'm slowly progressing to the Dave Grohl book. So far, so good. I love it. I think the podcast I will mention today. So if you like to hear about app development, or the struggles of getting big and doing a rewrite and all that, then I think this was great because Marco, who's the creator of the very popular Overcast app, I think at some point it was, maybe even now, it's the biggest podcast app on iOS outside of Apple and Spotify probably. It's one of the big ones. It's a single developer written. It's been over 10 years. It had become hard for him to manage that app. He decided to do a whole big rewrite of the new app. And that's been a journey because he decided to change some things, cut some features, and people got really mad about that. Marco is in 2 podcasts. One is called Accidental Tech Podcast, and episode 596 of it called A New Foundation for Progress. That's the one just before the launch they did, talking about the launch and what he's looking forward to and all that. And then there was a lot of backlash after the launch. So in his other podcast called Under the Radar, episode 300, The Aftermath, that's when they talk about what were the problems and what is he doing about it and how does he think about all that. These are both from the creator himself and other people. But then I've also found this really interesting, another podcast called Comfort Zone. And they did an episode called I Like to Read My Podcast recently in the last 2 weeks. And this is a pretty independent look at the rewrite and what worked, what didn't work, and how they think about it as a user. So I like that episode quite a lot too.
Yeah, I started listening to the ATP podcast too.
That's like an hour and a half long, and in the middle is a whole segment about very deep technical stuff. So
Yeah. I've never developed in Swift, but it was interesting to listen about the problems he was facing and the trade-offs he was making between the user experience and the technical simplicity. It was an interesting trade-off. It also gives us a peek inside the mind of our competitor, which is pretty cool. Competitive research.
Okay, so let's close this out. So yeah, the app is on Android right now and beta on iOS, launching very soon on the App Store. You can find the links at metacast.app. That's our website. There also you can find this podcast and our newsletter that Ilya does. Give it a listen. If you have any feedback or thoughts or features or requests for us, send it our way at hello@metacast.app.
hello@metacastpodcast.com.
That's for the podcast.
Yeah, for the app, it's feedback@metacast.app. And we started publishing blog posts on our blog at metacast.app, and we also cross-post them on our newsletter at metacastpodcast.com. I think what I did for previous one, basically I took the discussion that we had and then wrote an essay about the topics that we discussed, specifically about pricing. I think pricing was the main topic that we covered in episode 59. It covers more than the podcast, and also it goes into more depth. It has links. I genuinely think that our newsletter is getting better in that regard, and it's worth to be subscribed to at metacastpodcast.com.
If you're a person who likes to read rather than listen, then use the newsletter more. But then I'm wondering, why are you here 35 minutes into this episode listening to it if you don't like listening?
Exactly. I think it's for parasocial connection, which actually I don't know if we ever covered this term in the podcast. I remember it was Justin Jackson on one of our interviews. He mentioned this term. Then I had to Google it because I didn't know what it meant. And parasocial connection is the connection that is developed between people. It's like a one-sided connection. So it's like if somebody is listening to us talk, they develop a bond with us, but we may or may not know them. So it's this kind of weird feeling like they know us really well, whereas we may not even be aware of their existence, right? I definitely have that kind of feeling towards some of the podcasters that I regularly listen to. That's what's called parasocial connection.
We've met a few of such people who listen to our podcast and all that, and those have been wonderful to meet in person.
I remember when we met one of those people, also saying like, it feels so weird because I know so much about you and like you've just seen me for the first time.
But they only know the voice. So they only know us as like a voice plus some images probably conceived in their brain.
They may have watched the YouTube videos.
That's true. We do post on YouTube. I should have done my hair.
My wife was recently meeting someone she follows on Instagram. We never discussed it before, and she told me like it just felt so weird that she knows so much about that person. And to that person, she's just like a random person who wrote to her on Instagram and they decided to meet.
Yeah. Okay, so till the next time, stranger on the audio waves, you'll hear us next time. I guess we won't hear you. Unless you send us an email at hello@metacastpodcast.com.
Yes. Bye.
Bye.